Amidst the opulence of his own establishment, James Harrison, a black hotel owner, found himself being ushered out of his own lobby. The staff, blinded by prejudice, judged him solely on his appearance, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Little did they know, the truth would upend their fates and expose the system that condoned such injustice. When the veil of truth was lifted, it would alter not only the destinies of those involved but also shake the very foundations of the biases they upheld. What would happen next would astonish even the most seasoned observers. Let us delve into this story together, and if you believe in fairness and change, join us in the fight against systemic bias and injustice. Every small action you take contributes to a better world. James Harrison stood at the entrance of his luxurious hotel, the Grand Majestic. Instead of relying solely on dry reports, today he decided to personally observe his staff's service attitude. Remaining in the shadows was crucial, allowing him to witness the most authentic picture. The hotel looked flawless. Marble floors gleamed, chandeliers sparkled, and the reception staff at the front desk appeared professional. But James knew that outward appearances didn't always reflect the true reality within. Today, he was dressed modestly, jeans, a casual jacket, with no visible signs of his high status. To many, James looked like an ordinary guest, and that was precisely what he intended. It gave him the opportunity to observe how the staff interacted with guests without any bias. At first glance, everything in the lobby seemed peaceful, but James couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. Having grown up in a society still burdened by prejudice and racism, he wondered if it could occur even here, in his own hotel. As James approached the front desk, Ethan, a young receptionist, didn't even bother to glance at him. James stood before Ethan, waiting for a greeting, but the silence stretched too long. Ethan reluctantly raised his eyes, casting a cold glance at him, clearly displeased by the interruption. In a flat tone, without bothering to offer a smile, Ethan asked, "Can I help you?" Immediately, James sensed a shift in the atmosphere. It was the feeling of being judged not by merit but by appearance. Trying to remain calm, James inquired about room availability, though he already knew the answer. He simply wanted to see Ethan's reaction. Ethan glanced at the computer screen perfunctorily, not bothering to thoroughly check the system. "Sorry, all rooms are fully booked," Ethan replied curtly, then turned to speak with another staff member, as if James no longer existed. Holding his ground, James suppressed the rising frustration within him. This was a familiar scenario. His appearance and modest attire immediately placed him in the category of undesirable guest. He knew this wasn't a coincidence, and decided not to leave but to let the situation play out further. James remained at the desk, despite the cold reception. The disappointment within him grew, but he was far too accustomed to this kind of treatment. He wanted to see just how far the staff's prejudice would go. Maintaining a calm demeanor, he repeated his request. "Excuse me, could you please double-check my reservation? I booked a room in advance." Ethan, clearly irritated that the guest still hadn't left, sighed. Without bothering to be polite, he reluctantly began checking the reservation. Every gesture, every glance spoke volumes about his attitude. James was nothing more than an inconvenience to be removed. Ethan tapped a few keys mechanically, then with a barely concealed smirk said, "Sorry, I don't see any reservation under your name," his tone implied. "Get lost." James felt tension rise within him, but outwardly remained calm. He recognized this familiar behavior, being judged solely based on appearance. Ethan didn't even try to hide his contempt. But James was not about to back down easily. He gently asked the receptionist to check again. Ethan rolled his eyes, clearly showing his annoyance at the request. Sarah, another staff member, overheard the conversation, glanced briefly at James, then whispered something to Ethan before stepping back. "Maybe we should just kick him out," she whispered, loud enough for James to hear. That phrase stirred a mix of anger and disappointment within James. He was all too familiar with such attitudes, as if his mere presence was somehow undeserving. Ethan turned back to face James. "I already told you, we don't have any rooms for you. Maybe you should find somewhere else to stay," he sneered. His tone was so dismissive that James realized this wasn't about the hotel or the reservation. It was because he was black and didn't fit their preconceived notion of a guest in such a place. The receptionist's contemptuous words hung in the air as James felt a familiar surge of anger. It was all too familiar. He looked at Ethan, who didn't even attempt to conceal his disdain, realizing that this wasn't just a frustrated employee but a product of a system steeped in racial prejudice. Each time he faced something like this, it reminded him that his achievements, his status, could be erased in an instant simply because of the color of his skin. James took a deep breath, trying to control the storm within. In moments like these, his father's words echoed in his mind. He remembered how his father had taught him from a young age. You must work twice as hard and be twice as good because the world will always judge you by your skin, not your abilities. His father didn't just preach it, he lived by it. He had taught James that respect must be earned, even when the system didn't want to grant it. But every time he encountered situations like this, it felt like all those efforts were devalued. Doubts began to creep in. Should he fight now? Would it be better to simply leave and forget the situation? But James knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This moment was bigger than a simple conflict with employees. It was a challenge that couldn't be ignored. If he walked away now without revealing his true identity, it would mean accepting that this kind of treatment was normal, that it could be tolerated. James also thought of the other hotel guests who may have faced the same treatment but didn't have the power to defend themselves. His inner conflict grew stronger. Should he reveal his authority now, or allow the situation to unfold a bit more? He wanted to see just how far these people would go in their biased behavior. These thoughts quickly turned into resolve. He was here not just as a guest, but as the owner, and this was his chance to find out how things really stood in his hotel. James knew that only through moments like these could he truly impact the system that allowed such situations to happen. Realizing that James wasn't going to leave, Ethan was losing his patience. He glanced at Sarah, seeking support. Crossing his arms, Ethan spoke with obvious irritation. I said there are no rooms for you. I don't know what you're not understanding, but you need to leave. His tone left no room for doubt. This wasn't just a refusal of service. It was a blatant attempt to expel James as an unwanted guest. Sarah, sensing the rising tension, stepped closer and added, Maybe we should call security. We don't have time for these kinds of problems. The word problem hung in the air like a sentence, and James could clearly hear the subtext. They didn't want someone like him here. James looked at both of them, outwardly calm, though a mix of anger and disappointment bubbled inside. He knew that many in his position would have left long ago, exhausted by a system that so openly rejected them. But now was not the time to back down. He decided to let the situation play out a little longer, to see just how deep this prejudice would run. Ethan nodded to Sarah, who wasted no time calling security. Within minutes, 2 burly men in uniforms appeared in the lobby. Their presence instantly intensified the situation. One of them, tall and broad, walked straight up to James without asking any questions. Sir, you've been asked to leave the hotel. We'll escort you out, he said, without even trying to understand what was going on. James looked at the guards, realizing the situation was quickly turning into a confrontation. The security guards weren't interested in resolving the issue or understanding it. For them, the fact that the receptionist had deemed this guest undesirable was reason enough to act. This was yet another example of systemic racism, where one person's prejudice became the group's decision without question. Holding back his internal rage, James firmly responded, I'm not leaving. I have the right to be here. The guards exchanged glances, and the second one, in a harsher tone, added, If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to use force. This was the boiling point. James knew that the conflict had reached its climax, and now it was time to reveal his true identity. The security guards, having seen no response to their warning, moved forward. One of them took James by the elbow, attempting to forcibly remove him from the hotel. That action was the last straw. James knew that if he allowed himself to be pushed out, it wouldn't just be a personal defeat. It would be a silent admission that such systemic bias and discrimination were acceptable. He quickly pulled his arm free, leaving the guard momentarily stunned, and calmly said, "It seems you don't know who you're dealing with." The security guards exchanged confused looks. One of them sneered dismissively. "And who might you be?" asked the second guard, his tone mocking. At that moment, James pulled out his wallet from an inner pocket and showed them his ID, clearly identifying him as the owner of the hotel and an entire chain of hotels. Ethan, Sarah, and the guards froze, shocked by this unexpected revelation. Their faces changed in an instant. Where once there had been contempt and arrogance, there was now confusion and fear. Ethan gulped, realizing the gravity of his mistake. "This is a joke, right?" Sarah muttered weakly, staring at James's ID. But his gaze left no doubt. He was the owner, and the situation was now completely out of their control. "You've just tried to throw the owner of the hotel out because you judged me based on how I look," James said slowly and firmly, his voice calm but full of authority. He put the ID back in his pocket and looked directly at Ethan. "You didn't even bother to check my reservation. You didn't think I could be someone important. All you saw was how I look." A heavy silence fell over the room. The guards didn't know what to say. Ethan, now visibly shaken, tried to find words to justify himself, but understanding the enormity of what had just happened, all he could manage was, We didn't know." Sarah, who had been standing nearby, was also at a loss, not knowing how to react to this sudden reversal. James continued to look at them with cold determination. He knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the system that allowed such treatment to occur. The silence that enveloped the lobby was deafening. Ethan, Sarah, and the security guards stood frozen, unsure of how to get out of this mess. Their faces were full of confusion and shame. James kept looking at them, feeling the tension building in the air. This was the moment when all their confidence and arrogance collapsed in an instant. "You didn't know, did you? Did you need to know who I was to show basic respect?" James said calmly, but his words carried weight. Sarah and Ethan remained silent, as if their words were stuck in their throats. They realized that their actions were dictated not by hotel policies, but by their own biased assumptions about who was worthy to stay at this hotel. James decided to say no more because he knew they already understood. Now it was up to the hotel's management to deal with the consequences. The security guards, realizing that things had gone too far, began to edge away, hoping their role in the incident would be forgotten. But James turned to them. "You thought you could decide who had the right to be here based solely on appearance?" The guards stood silently, knowing that their actions were now under scrutiny. A few minutes later, the hotel manager appeared in the lobby, his face tense as he learned what had happened. He approached James with an expression of deep guilt. "Mr. Walker, I deeply apologize for this incident. I can't believe this happened at our hotel," his voice full of panic and shame. James gave him a calm look. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for change," he said, his voice firm. The manager nodded, clearly understanding that this incident was about more than just an isolated case. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem that needed urgent attention. "You'll need to reconsider how your staff is trained and how they operate," James continued. "I won't tolerate anyone facing this kind of treatment in my hotel. This isn't the first case of bias, and if you don't change your policies, it won't be the last." The manager sighed and, bowing his head slightly, quietly replied, "We'll review all our procedures and conduct special training for the staff. This will never happen again." James nodded in agreement, but deep down he knew that words were one thing, and real change was another. He understood that this incident had to serve as a lesson not only for these employees but for the entire system that allowed them to think such behavior was acceptable. After the meeting with the manager, James left the lobby and sat on a couch in the hotel's lounge. He knew that this incident was only the tip of the iceberg, and the prejudice he had encountered ran deep throughout many layers of society. He thought back to conversations with his father, who always reminded him, "Don't be afraid to raise your head and fight for what's right." These words had stuck with him throughout his life, and today they felt especially relevant. James dialed the number of his wife, Leah. Her support had always been his most important resource in difficult moments. When she answered, there was concern in her voice. "Are you okay? I know you didn't just check the hotel today for no reason." James briefly told her what had happened, and she listened silently, understanding that this wasn't just another workday. "I knew you'd eventually face something like this," Leah said, "but I'm proud that you didn't just accept it. You decided to change the situation." Her words gave James a sense of relief. He knew that his family would always be his rock, and that gave him the strength to keep fighting. "You always said you wanted to create a space where other people wouldn't have to deal with what you've been through. That's been your plan from the start, not just to be successful, but to use that success to change the world around you. Today you took another step in that direction," Leah added. Her words reinforced James's resolve. He knew that the support of his family was what gave him the strength to keep pushing forward, even when it seemed like the system was too entrenched to change. James also knew that his actions would have a ripple effect on the hotel staff and their attitudes toward guests. He hadn't just exposed their bias, he had given them a lesson that could change their way of thinking. After the call with Leah, James reflected on the community he grew up in. His family and friends had always supported him on his journey to success, and that community was an important part of his life. He knew that many people who faced discrimination didn't have the same resources or opportunities he had. This strengthened his resolve to use his position to fight for those who couldn't defend themselves. This hotel incident reminded James that the work was far from over. His family's and community's support would always be his foundation in the fight for justice and equality. He knew that many challenges lay ahead, but now he felt an even greater responsibility to continue pushing for change in a system where bias had become the norm. James rose from the couch and looked around. The entire situation had forced him to think beyond his personal experiences. This case had become a symbol of the systemic injustice that many Black people face every day, whether in hotels, at work, or in public spaces. James understood that his goal was not just to punish those at fault, but to change the system itself. He noticed how Sarah and Ethan, still shaken, exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to do next. James approached them. "This wasn't just a mistake," James said calmly, without raising his voice, but his words carried significant weight. "You acted based on biased assumptions, but now you have a chance to learn something new." Sarah nodded, while Ethan still looked embarrassed. James knew that change wouldn't happen instantly, but this lesson was crucial for both of them. He turned to the hotel manager, who was standing nearby, and firmly stated, "I expect this place to become an example for other hotels. It's not enough to conduct staff training, you must build a culture where situations like this are simply impossible. I want to see these changes, and I will personally follow up." The manager nodded, realizing that this incident was not just a one-off case. It was a reflection of deeper systemic issues that needed to be addressed at the core. This wasn't only about his reputation as a manager, but also the future of the hotel itself. James understood that his mission wasn't limited to resolving this situation. This moment had to serve as an example of how to treat guests, no matter their appearance or social status. He knew that many more challenges awaited, but taking this first step was crucial. It wasn't enough to make people think, he needed to change the system that allowed such incidents to happen. As James left the hotel, he felt that this was not merely a personal victory. He knew that every small step, every confrontation like this, brought him closer to his ultimate goal, creating a world where respect and dignity are fundamental principles for everyone, regardless of skin color. This day was a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is long and difficult, but with the support of his family, community, and his own determination, he could achieve the changes that many others needed, not just him. In this way, James walked away from the hotel, knowing that this was not the end, but just the beginning of a much larger journey toward justice and equality.